In a neighborhood where every lawn matched, every mailbox was approved, and every decision flowed through the iron grip of the HOA, I had one forbidden luxury: a private pool. It should have been a blessing, a shimmering escape from the summer heat. Instead, it became the spark that lit a war with the one person who believed the neighborhood belonged to her, Karen. The summer sun was relentless, drenching the neighborhood in waves of heat that shimmered off the asphalt and pressed down on every rooftop like a weight. Most residents dealt with it the usual way: air conditioners running non-stop, blinds pulled tight, and cold drinks sweating on kitchen counters. But in my backyard, I had something different, something rare enough in this HOA-controlled subdivision that it might as well have been a beacon. A private pool. It wasn't just any pool either. The builders had installed it just before the HOA was formed, meaning it was grandfathered in, free from their usual suffocating regulations. The board hated it, particularly Karen, the president's wife and self-appointed enforcer, while everyone else was forced to live with dry lawns and cookie-cutter restrictions. I had a sparkling blue oasis waiting for me each time I stepped outside. And that, as far as Karen was concerned, was a crime. At first, her resentment showed only in petty ways: sideways glares when I carried out pool supplies, whispered complaints during HOA meetings about eyesores and unfair privileges, even anonymous letters tucked into my mailbox hinting that perhaps the pool was a liability, a danger to the neighborhood's children. I brushed it all off because none of it had teeth. The pool was legal, it was safe, and it was mine. But resentment has a way of festering, and in time, Karen's annoyance grew into something bolder, something shameless. The first time I noticed it, it was subtle enough that I almost doubted myself. Walking past the back window late one night, I caught a glimpse of water rippling unnaturally. The moonlight reflected off something moving in the pool, and I froze. By the time I opened the back door, the water was still, empty, and silent. Maybe I had imagined it, I thought. Maybe the breeze had stirred the surface, or a raccoon had gotten curious. But then came the mornings. Twice, I stepped out to find wet footprints leading away from the patio. Another time, the chlorine floater had been pulled to the shallow end, like someone had been batting it around. And then, the worst sign yet, a plastic wine glass left on the poolside table, dripping condensation onto the stone. That was no raccoon. The truth settled on me slowly, like storm clouds rolling in. Karen and her circle of neighborhood friends, women who strutted around the subdivision, as if every driveway belonged to them, had been sneaking into my backyard. They weren't just jealous of the pool. They were helping themselves to it. At first, I tried to reason it out in my head. Maybe they thought it was harmless. Maybe they believed that since we lived in the same HOA, the pool was community property. But the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. This wasn't harmless. It was a violation. They had crossed into my yard, trespassed on my property, and used something that was mine without permission. Worse, they were smug about it, I could tell. Karen and her friends always wore the same satisfied smirks, the same knowing glances whenever they saw me drive past. The final confirmation came one Saturday afternoon. I had left to run errands, but returned earlier than planned. As I pulled into the driveway, laughter carried over the privacy fence, loud and unrestrained. It wasn't my imagination this time. I crept to the back gate, and there they were. Karen herself lounged on one of my chairs, oversized sunglasses on her face and a half-empty bottle of wine beside her. Two of her friends splashed each other in the shallow end, their shrieks piercing the quiet air. Another floated lazily on an inflatable I hadn't touched in weeks. They were sprawled across my backyard like it was their private resort. Towels draped over my furniture, shoes kicked carelessly into the grass. My blood boiled. I stood there, unseen, gripping the edge of the fence so hard the wood dug into my palms. A dozen thoughts raced through my mind at once. I could storm in and scream. I could call the police. I could drag every last one of them out of the water by force. But even in my rage, I knew that was what they wanted. They wanted a scene, a chance to twist the story, to play victim when the HOA inevitably tried to side with them. No, I thought. This wouldn't be settled with shouting. If they wanted to play games in my pool, then I'd make sure they paid the price. From that moment on, I began planning. I took stock of everything: the layout of the yard, The weak spots in the fence where they slipped in, the times of day they thought I was gone. I set up cameras, hidden where no one could see. I checked my locks twice over, testing the gate, the patio doors, even the shed. And then I waited, because I knew Karen. She wasn't going to stop, not until she was embarrassed, exposed, and left with no excuse to hide behind. And I intended to make sure that when the time came, the whole neighborhood would see exactly what she and her friends had been doing. The trespasses had begun with quiet splashes and empty wine glasses. Soon, they would end with something far louder and far uglier. And as I watched the footage from my first night of surveillance, catching Karen herself slipping into the pool under the cover of darkness, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had no idea what was coming next. The footage from the night camera became my proof and my fuel. Grainy at the edges, lit only by the faint halo of the yard light, it showed the silhouettes slipping through the gap beneath the fence. The practiced ease of people who believed entitlement made them invisible. Karen's profile, her unmistakable bob, and the dramatic sweep of her shoulders as she stepped through filled the frame. She moved like she owned the place, like the act itself was a statement. This is mine to borrow, yours to resent. Watching them on repeat was strange. The more I saw, the less shocked I felt. I saw the small, private rituals of trespass, the muffled laughter right before someone dove under the water, the careful placement of towels on chairs so they could appear at a glance as mere guests. In a public park, they treated my space like a stage, and their performances were about proving a point to each other and to the neighborhood. It was not a spontaneous crime of opportunity. It was a rehearsed spectacle. The plan that formed inside me was not about revenge for revenge's sake. It was methodical. There was an audience out their phone cameras, neighbors who murmured to each other about those women at block parties, and rules under which the HOA operated. Rules Karen cherished and used like a hammer. She loved precedent. She loved to point at bylaws and declarations as if they were scripture. The irony was delicious. She had weaponized policy for years, shaping the narrative of the neighborhood with fines and letters and whispered power. Now, policy could be the scalpel I used to expose her hypocrisy. I started small, precise. First, I cataloged the evidence, not just the video, but the breadcrumbs Karen and her friends left behind. The wet wine glass, the bronze tan lines on a chaise cushion that had been dry minutes earlier, a smear of sunscreen on the deck rail. Each one was a fact, and facts are hard to argue with. I compiled timestamps, cross-referenced the nights when the neighborhood garden camera caught the same women lingering at the community clubhouse, and noted the days when HOA emails had conveniently scheduled meetings. At times those women were otherwise indisposed. Everything fit together, and together it formed a pattern that spoke louder than any single outrage. Next I thought about leverage. Lawsuits meant lawyers, and lawyers meant expense. Public shaming meant unpredictable backlash. Instead, I focused on the one thing Karen worshipped more than the rules: reputation. Her place in the social hierarchy of the HOA was not just a function of her marriage or her position on the board. It was an image she maintained daily, curated like a gallery. People followed her cues. If she flitted her eyelashes at a complaint, the complaint became real. If she tutted at an untrimmed shrub, the guilty homeowner apologized with a check. So I decided to cut that thread. The first step in that direction was subtle. I began leaving things where everyone could find them. Pool toys floating in the community pond, with an army of ants taking the long way home. A pristine white towel draped over the HOA bulletin board that carried the smell of my backyard sanitizer. The unmistakable imprint of my pool brand logo facing out for anyone who glanced at it. It was theater without spectacle small. Intentional reminders that my pool existed and that it was used without permission. People noticed. Neighbors who had been polite but distant started to exchange knowing looks. A few stopped smiling at Karen in the grocery store aisles. I also tightened the perimeter. I reinforced the fence at the weak point where the camera showed them slipping through. I planted a line of tactile shrubs whose branches snagged on clothing, designed to be more annoyance than threat. I installed a chime on the gate, old-fashioned and loud, so that the night would not swallow their footsteps without leaving a sound behind. It felt petty, maybe even parental, but it was effective. Intrusions became clumsier. The smugness on their faces in the footage was now replaced by quick glances and hurried exits. But the real turning point came when I turned what I knew into a story, and stories spread. I printed a concise, factual summary of the evidence, dates, times, photos from the camera laid out not as accusation, but as documentation. The sheet read like a police report without the fury, a plain ledger of trespass. I slipped it under the doors of 3 adjacent homes, the ones owned by people who had complained quietly about HOA antics for years, but had no appetite for open conflict. I slid the packet into the mailbox of the HOA treasurer, the one who always called meetings early and seemed perpetually puzzled by the rising costs. I left another copy, simply placed and unannounced, on the community center table where volunteers signed in for their shifts. The reaction was immediate and delicious in its own slow way. Neighbors who once nodded politely now lingered in conversation, referencing the packet as if it were something they had independently discovered. Whisper networks ignited. The HOA treasurer, who had never once confronted Karen in a vocal way, sent a terse email requesting a private meeting. The seeds of curiosity, the thing Karen had used for years to bend the community to her will, were sprouting in my favor. People started to ask questions that could not be answered by a shrug or an offended gasp. Of course, this was not without risk. There were moments when I wondered if I had simply started a neighborhood circus. There were messages, anonymous, passive-aggressive, left on my car windshield. Curious why you're so worried. There was the one night when someone slashed the inflatable raft I had always kept folded at the side of the shed. The raft was a small, symbolic casualty, but it stung. It was an escalation in kind. They were willing to threaten, and threats carry a dangerous undertone. That only hardened my resolve. I refused to be intimidated by property damage when the damage had been ongoing and unapologetic. For months, eyes were now watching both ways. If they wanted to step over boundaries, I would make sure the path back was impossible to retrace. I contacted a local locksmith to install a reinforced gate lock and purchased a motion-activated floodlight, the kind that snaps on like a spotlight and cuts through the night with the merciless clarity of truth. The floodlight was the most satisfying addition. It turned every midnight splash into a stage under a glare, a public act with an invisible audience of 100 neighbors, and a file of evidence waiting to be seen. Now the neighborhood rhythm changed. What had once been a slow, simmering irritation on the edges of polite community life became sharper, defined. Conversations at the mailbox stopped feeling like small talk and took on a new tack. Who had seen what, when, and how often? People who had been cowed by Karen's little edicts began to speak in the language of facts instead of feelings. The social armor she wore, precise hair, curated outfits, the practiced laugh started to crack in places. She could no longer be the singular sculptor of narrative. Because I had handed the neighbors a mirror and told them the truth reflected, there was not flattering. And yet, even as the current turned, I sensed Karen circling, sizing me up. She did not attack openly. She was smarter than that. Instead, she refined her smile, turned it outward like varnish, and carried on as if nothing was wrong. That, more than anything, made me hungry for the next move. The payoff I planned was not about public humiliation alone. It was about rewriting the ledger so that the record of her trespasses and the record of her hypocrisy would sit side by side for anyone who cared to compare them. The groundwork had been laid, evidence compiled, narrative nudged. Karen and her friends had been shoved slowly, methodically into a corner where their own habits would be their downfall. I could smell the coming shift in the air. Like ozone before a storm, people were ready to listen to facts, and facts, unlike gossip, are stubborn things. So I waited, patient and precise, letting the neighborhood win through the newly planted hedges and the camera capture every misstep. The first dent in Karen's armor would arrive not as a shout, but as a small, undeniable moment, a meeting, a formal complaint, a recorded board vote. Once the paperwork started, precedent, the thing Karen loved, would cut both ways. The world she had built on the backs of minor tyrannies would begin to tilt, and when it did, it would not stop at a single ripple. The day of the monthly HOA meeting arrived like a summons, the kind that sits at the bottom of the inbox and hums with quiet menace. until it can no longer be ignored. The community center felt smaller than usual. The folding chairs arranged in neat rows and the long table at the front heavy with the weight of agendas and last month's minutes. People came in pairs and small clusters, carrying coffee cups, and the sort of guarded expressions that meant they had rehearsed civility and were prepared to use it as armor. Karen walked in with her practiced poise, a smile that suggested nothing at all, the kind of smile that doubled as a shield and a statement. She had done this 1,000 times, led meetings, read covenants aloud, delivered reprimands with a near-religious zeal. Her voice had the power to stop arguments and start bylaws, and for years it had been the neighborhood's metronome. But the metronome had a new tempo now, and it was not hers to set. The treasurer's private meeting request had been the match. He arrived with the packet I had left in his mailbox tucked under his arm like contraband, and with it came an urgency that cut through the usual politeness. He did not accuse. He asked for clarification. He did not demand spectacle. He asked to understand the facts. That alone had been enough to tilt the board's posture from defensive to inquisitive. In an HOA built on appearances and precedents, a board member's quiet curiosity had more weight than any whispered rumor. When the right moment came, the treasurer stood and set the packet on the table. The room shifted, the air drew in, pages were unfolded, phone screens turned to capture the images, and the grainy footage from my night camera was played aloud, projected against the plain wall where the community calendar usually lived. The sound of water sloshing and muffled laughter filled the room, an odd soundtrack to the sudden stillness. For the first time in a long time, conversation stalled and neighbors watched a truth they had not wanted to examine. There was a specific power to the presentation that had nothing to do with melodrama. It was the measured chronology, the timestamps, the neat list of nights and behaviors, evidence laid out like a ledger. It refused interpretation and demanded only recognition. The footage showed what the packet described: silhouettes slipping under the fence, the wine glass on the table, the casual etiquette of trespass. The camera had captured ritual, and ritual is hard to disentangle from intent. Karen's face was the most interesting thing in the room as the footage played. The practiced smile thinned into a series of micro-expressions that betrayed the earnestness she had perfected in public. She watched herself on the wall with a kind of careful neutrality, the managerial mask of someone assessing damage and figuring the best angle for spin. That alone told a story, guilt wrapped in strategy. The board could have dismissed it as private feuding. They could have called it neighborhood drama and sent everyone home with a form letter reminding residents of respect and community standards. Instead, the treasurer's quiet insistence translated into motion. A formal complaint would be filed, an investigation would be opened. The community rules, those same bylaws Karen invoked weekly, were suddenly being wielded against the behavior they had been used to justify. What followed over the next weeks was an exercise in slow, administrative pressure that felt more devastating than one explosive confrontation. Notices were sent according to procedure, requests for statements, invitations to an investigatory committee, polite but firm reminders of property boundaries. Karen and her circle responded with what they always did when cornered: calculated deflection. They wrote emails that oozed offended dignity. They circulated alternate narratives about community access and misunderstandings, and they leaned on the fragile goodwill they had accrued through years of social maneuvering. But social currency has a limit when facts are documented and publicly filed. The investigatory committee, made up of residents who had tired of whispering behind hands, interviewed witnesses. They reviewed timestamps, compared footage, and then, most damningly, asked Karen and her friends to provide their own accounts. The request was procedural, benign on the surface, but it forced a choice: denial with risk of contradiction or confession with social cost. Karen chose the middle ground she had perfected: partial truth and moralizing spin. She admitted presence in the general area, framed the occasions as brief stops, and appealed to the idea of shared community resources, an argument that, up until recently, might have persuaded a sympathetic board member. But the committee had the footage, the smell of sanitizer on towels, and neighbors who had started to keep informal logs because the trespasses had become a public nuisance. The record grew heavy, and the gap between Karen's words and the documented reality widened into a canyon. Eventually, the committee's recommendation was blunt and procedural: a fine for trespass, a formal warning entered into the whole records, and a demand for restitution for any damage to property. It was not ruinous, not at first, but it carried symbolism that mattered more than the financial cost. For someone who had built an identity on moral superiority, being fined by the very body she had used to browbeat others was a calculated humiliation. The announcement of the committee's decision created ripples outside the meeting room. Neighbors, who had once looked the other way, began to nod when they passed. Their nods not of approval so much as recognition that a boundary had been acknowledged and enforced. Karen's social circle splintered in quiet ways. Some friends distanced themselves with gentle messages about being busy. Others staged small performances of outrage on social platforms, crafting narratives of persecution and overreach. That was expected. Karen had always been adept at turning splintered sympathies into moral crusades. But the more important change was less visible: an erosion of the unquestioned authority she had enjoyed. Her power had always been twofold: formal, through the board, and informal, through social networks. The fine struck at both. Formally, it was evidence that the board could be asked to hold its own accountable. Informally, it exposed the cost of being the person who defined proper for everyone else. Reputation, once a fortress, now showed cracks. Karen did not accept defeat in silence. She shifted tactics into retaliation, a series of small, precise moves that read like a familiar playbook: call-outs at meetings about unrelated violations, hints at the narrator's hostility, the cultivation of new allies through whispered versions of the story. Accusations were leveled casually in conversations, designed to muddy the water: insinuations about motive, suggestions that the narrator was making mountains out of molehills. It was the last resort of someone losing grip. If the facts cannot be overturned, then the storyteller must be discredited. Meanwhile, the narrator maintained composure, avoiding the temptation to escalate emotionally. There was a strategic patience, an awareness that anger could furnish Karen with the narrative she wanted: an oppressor dramatized, and an offended neighbor reduced to hysteria. Instead, the narrator continued to document, to respond only in the language of policy and evidence. Every email, every board note, every camera file was filed and duplicated. The approach was not vengeful theater, but bureaucratic diligence. And in that diligence lay a certain cruelty. It left no room for the comfortable reinterpretation of events. Karen relied upon as consequences accrued. Neighborhood dynamics shifted. The pool, once a quiet symbol of private pleasure, had become a line in the sand. The social rituals of summer block parties, casual barbecues, blind smiles in the mailbox began to rearrange round the new axis of accountability. People who had hidden their discomfort at the board's heavy hand now felt emboldened to speak. Others, who once deferred to Karen's curt moralizing, found themselves asking for receipts. And yet, within the churn of rules and fines and whispered counsel, there was an edge of danger. Karen's retaliation was small, but escalating: a smear aimed at the narrator's character, an anonymous complaint to a local paper about community discord, the deliberate trashing of a small garden hedge in the dead of night. Each act was a reminder that power, when humiliated, could lash out unpredictably. The narrator noted each new bruise without flinching. The record grew thicker. By the time the board's decision became final and the fine posted, the neighborhood had taken sides in a way no one expected. It was not an all-out war, more a redistribution of loyalties. Some rallied to Karen's defense out of habit or fear. Others drifted toward the narrator's side out of principle or annoyance turned principled. The most important shift, however, was quiet and bureaucratic. Karen's name appeared on an official HOA record as fine for trespass. The notation was small and unimaginative, but it was, in its own way, absolute. The chapter closed with the unsettling sense that rules, once turned against their most ardent proponent, can be more dangerous than any shouted confrontation. Karen watched her authority shrink a fraction each day, and in that shrinking there was a dangerous recalibration. She was neither defeated nor cowed. Instead, she plotted in the narrow channels left to her: social media, whispered calls, and the subtle sabotage of reputations. The narrator, for their part, prepared for the next phase with the clinical satisfaction of someone who had built a report. Out of months of behavior, the pool would remain a boundary marker, the cameras would remain where they were, and the newly emboldened neighbors would watch for the next misstep. The scene was set for escalation, but not in the way Karen expected. The next move would not be a public spectacle. It would be surgical, and it would cut where it mattered most. The fine should have been the end of it. Most residents, when caught bending the rules, would swallow their pride, pay what was owed, and retreat into quiet compliance. But Karen was not most residents. For her, the fine was not just a penalty, it was a public scar, a record that threatened the perfect image she had cultivated for years. She could not allow it to stand uncontested. And so she did what she had always done when cornered. She doubled down. The retaliation began with whispers, subtle enough that they might have been overlooked if not for the pattern. Neighbors mentioned in passing that Karen had been calling the pool unsafe, implying it was a liability waiting to happen. Others repeated that she had framed the fine as a vendetta, a weapon wielded by an angry neighbor who had turned community into hostility. Each retelling added a new flourish, a new insinuation designed to muddy the facts and plant doubt. Then came the anonymous letters, printed neatly on HOA stationery but without signatures. They accused me of creating a toxic environment, of weaponizing surveillance, and of undermining community cohesion. The language was carefully chosen to mimic official correspondence, but the intent was unmistakable. It was an attempt to discredit, to shift focus from her trespass to my response. I filed them away in my growing record, knowing full well where they originated. Karen's friends, too, played their parts. At neighborhood gatherings, they made loud jokes about pool patrol, feigned innocence when anyone asked about the fine, and performed their loyalty with theatrical indignation. They were no longer just sneaking into my yard. They were trying to turn me into the villain, to paint my insistence on boundaries as obsession. It was reputation warfare, and Karen had declared it without hesitation. But what Karen never accounted for was my patience. She mistook silence for weakness, restraint for vulnerability. While she spun her stories, I kept collecting. The cameras remained, capturing more than just poolside trespasses now. They caught the late-night vandalism of my hedge, the deliberate scattering of trash near my side gate, the way one of Karen's friends tugged at the lock on my shed as if testing for weakness. Each new act added weight to the file, each clip another nail in the coffin of her narrative. And then, the perfect opportunity arrived not through confrontation, but through paperwork. The HOA circulated its annual review, a thick packet of budgets, expenditures, and board member reports. Buried within the dry text was a line item for community maintenance supplies, a figure far larger than previous years. The treasurer, now quietly aligned with me after seeing how Karen twisted every defense, mentioned offhand that he had never signed off on the number. Suspicion rippled, soft at first but unmistakable. I knew then that it was time to strike not with anger, but with the same weapon Karen had used for years, procedure. I drafted a formal letter to the board, attaching the growing body of evidence I had compiled, not just of pool trespasses, but of the harassment, the vandalism, and the questionable budget numbers that pointed to misuse of funds. I couched it in the language of concern, never accusation, and requested that the board review the matter in the spirit of transparency. The response was immediate. A special meeting was called. Neighbors who had never attended before packed the small community center, drawn by the scent of scandal. The cameras rolled again, but this time they were phone cameras, held by residents eager to capture whatever unfolded. Karen entered, still smiling, still coiffed to perfection, but her eyes betrayed her awareness that the ground was shifting beneath her. The evidence was presented methodically, each piece displayed without commentary, each fact allowed to speak for itself. Footage of her friends tugging at my shed lock, a still image of the trash scattered deliberately across my lawn, the night clip of her slipping through the fence again, despite the fine already levied, and then the financial discrepancies laid out in neat columns, paired with the treasurer's admission that he had never approved them. The room buzzed with a different kind of energy now, not the polite deference Karen was used to, but suspicion, even anger. For years, she had been the arbiter of order, the the one who scolded and fined and lectured. Now the mirror was turned, and the reflection staring back was not flattering. Karen tried to rally, to invoke her familiar script. She called the footage taken out of context. She claimed the vandalism was coincidence, the budget numbers clerical error. She raised her voice, invoked her role as president's wife, reminded everyone of her service to the community. But the words fell flat. The more she spoke, the more transparent her desperation became. And then came the vote. The board, pressured by neighbors who were no longer content to be silent, agreed to open a full audit of the HOA finances and to censure Karen formally for repeated trespasses and harassment. The word censure hung in the air like a bell toll, its weight not in the punishment itself but in the precedent it set. For the first time, Karen was not the enforcer of rules, but the subject of them. The meeting ended not with shouting, but with murmurs, neighbors gathering in small knots, exchanging glances that no longer carried fear. Karen stormed out, her friends trailing behind her, their indignation suddenly brittle. The balance had shifted, and everyone knew it. But even as I walked home, the satisfaction was tempered with caution. Karen was not the kind of person to accept defeat quietly. She had been exposed, humiliated, and stripped of authority. But humiliation is not the same as surrender. If anything, it makes the humiliated more dangerous. The pool sat still that night, its water reflecting the glow of the new floodlight. It was quiet, private once again, but I knew it would not stay that way for long. Karen had lost her battle in the boardroom, and now she would turn her sights on something far less predictable. The war for reputation was over. The war for control was just beginning. The weeks that followed the censure carried a deceptive calm, like the hush after a storm when the sky is too still and the air too heavy. The pool sat untouched, my property line unbreached, and the cameras captured nothing but raccoons and stray cats prowling under the floodlight. On the surface, it appeared Karen had accepted her punishment, withdrawn from her nightly intrusions, and retreated to lick her wounds in private. But that was never who Karen was. Silence from her was not surrender, it was strategy. The first signs of escalation came quietly. A neighbor mentioned that she'd heard Karen talking about safety concerns with my property. Another repeated a rumor that my pool's installation had been irregular, despite the fact it predated the HOA entirely. It was classic Karen. When she couldn't control through direct action, she seeded doubt, hoping suspicion would grow roots in the fertile soil of gossip. Then the letters resumed. Not anonymous this time, but official complaints filed through the HOA system. Each one alleged a new infraction. My floodlight was excessive and intrusive. My shrubs along the fence were encroaching on community space. My pool pump was too loud and disruptive. Every complaint was designed to turn the spotlight back onto me, to paint me as the problem neighbor, the one straining the community with selfishness. I documented each one, filing responses with meticulous precision, attaching evidence, and noting the pattern. The board, now wary of Karen's games after the audit had begun, treated them with suspicion rather than deference. But it was clear, what she was doing, she was no longer trying to win in the court of neighborly opinion. She was trying to bury me under the weight of procedure, hoping the sheer hassle would wear me down. It might have worked on someone else, but patience was my weapon, and every false claim she filed only became another entry in my growing dossier. Still, procedure was only half of her play. The other half was sabotage. It started one morning when I found my gate lock jammed with glue, the metal keyhole clogged with hardened residue that no tool could budge. A week later, the chlorine levels in the pool plummeted inexplicably, as if someone had tampered with the balance. The final straw came when I discovered shards of glass scattered across the shallow end, an act not of petty vandalism, but of malice, one that could have seriously injured anyone who stepped inside unaware. That was the moment I realized Karen had crossed from manipulation into outright danger. This was no longer about trespass or reputation. This was about sabotage, a reckless escalation that put lives at risk. I called in reinforcements, not the police, not yet, but a private investigator recommended by the treasurer himself, a quiet, thorough man with a camera sharper than mine and a knack for following patterns. I gave him everything I had, the footage, the logs, the vandalism. He set up his own surveillance, camouflaged in ways Karen would never suspect. If she thought she was clever, she had underestimated just how visible she had become. The first night his cameras ran, they caught her. Not in my yard, but at the edge of it, crouching near the fence line, with something glinting in her hand. A tool, maybe, or a bottle, it didn't matter. The footage showed intent, and intent was all I needed. Over the next week, more clips followed. Karen pacing near my property in the dead of night. One of her friends slipping a bag into my trash can. Another walking quickly away after rattling the gate. They had turned my home into their theater of war, and the cameras had captured every performance. The investigator compiled it all into a neat, professional report, one that made my own records look amateur by comparison. Dates, times, high-resolution stills, a timeline of escalating behavior. It was undeniable. With it in hand, I finally had leverage not just in the HOA, but in the law. I weighed my options carefully. Pressing charges would be satisfying, but public court cases dragged neighbors through mud they didn't want. What I wanted wasn't just punishment, it was finality. I wanted Karen stripped of her power so thoroughly that she could never rebuild it. Her credibility shattered in a way no whisper or smear could repair. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. The HOA audit revealed irregularities, expenses that had no receipts, line items that led to personal purchases rather than community upkeep. It wasn't enough to prove fraud outright, but it was enough to demand accountability. And when the board called for an emergency meeting to discuss the findings, I knew the timing was perfect. That evening, I arrived with the investigator's report in hand. The room was fuller than ever, neighbors drawn by the promise of drama, their patience with Karen long since worn thin. The board presented the audit results first, each irregularity laid out with grim precision. Karen shifted in her seat, her smile brittle, her eyes darting between her friends as if searching for a lifeline. And then I stepped forward. I laid the report on the table, page after page of documented sabotage, vandalism, and trespass. The high-resolution still of Karen crouching by my fence filled the projector screen, her face unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the room. Her friends looked away, unwilling to share in the exposure. There was no spin left to her. No explanation could excuse the shards of glass in my pool, the glue in my lock, the evidence captured in crystal clarity. For years she had thrived on rumor, implication, and authority. But facts, stacked neatly in a dossier, left her defenseless. The board's vote was swift, effective immediately. Karen was banned from serving in any official HOA capacity. Her fine was tripled to cover the damages and the cost of the investigation. And perhaps most satisfying of all, a restraining order was filed, barring her from stepping within 10 feet of my property line. She left the meeting in silence, her friends trailing behind her, the once smug smiles gone from their faces. The neighborhood, for the first time in years, felt lighter. But even as I sat by the pool that night, the water calm and unbroken, I knew the story was not over. Karen was humiliated, yes, but humiliation can fester into something darker. She had lost her power, her reputation, and her control, but people like Karen rarely fade quietly into the background. The question that lingered in the humid night air was simple. Would she retreat? Or would she come back for one last desperate strike? The restraining order had teeth, sharper than any warning letter or fine the HOA had ever issued. For weeks, my poolside evenings were quiet, the air free of Karen's shrill intrusions and the threat of her unwanted guests. The cameras showed nothing but the usual blur of neighborhood cats and the shimmer of dragonflies at dusk. Neighbors passed by with nods instead of side glances, their relief palpable. It seemed, at last, the storm had broken. But deep down, I knew better. Karen wasn't someone who yielded to rules. She bent them until they broke. To her, the restraining order wasn't an end, it was a challenge. The question wasn't whether she would retaliate, but how. The first clue came on a muggy Thursday evening. I noticed tire tracks in the gravel near the side entrance of my yard, pressed deep into the soil as though someone had idled there, waiting. My cameras hadn't caught a license plate, but I didn't need one to guess who might be circling like a vulture. Then came the notes. Handwritten slips tucked into my mailbox, unsigned, but unmistakably hers. They were taunts, laced with venom, hinting that she still had allies willing to do her bidding. She could no longer step foot on my property, but she could still whisper into the ears of others. Still send shadows in her place. And shadows did come. One night, the cameras picked up two figures slinking near my fence, flashlights sweeping low across the ground. They weren't careful enough. The motion detectors flared to life, bathing them in harsh white light, and they fled before they could touch the gate. But the intent was clear. Karen was trying to circumvent the restraining order by proxy. It was the boldest, most reckless move she had attempted yet, and it would be her last. I turned the new footage over to the investigator, who wasted no time looping in law enforcement. With the restraining order already on file, even indirect attempts at harassment became violations. The police, cautious until then, suddenly had all the justification they needed. The trap was set. 2 nights later, the shadows returned. This time, they carried bags, tools, ropes, something heavy clinking in the dark. They crept toward the pool, unaware that the cameras weren't just recording, but feeding live to a squad car parked less than a block away. The moment they touched the gate, the police moved in. What unfolded was swift, almost surgical. Flashing lights cut through the night as officers converged. The 2 intruders froze, caught mid-act, their bags spilling open to reveal bolt cutters, crowbars, and bottles of chemicals, proof of intent to vandalize, perhaps even poison the water. They were cuffed on the spot, faces pale with shock. And then the names came out. They weren't strangers. They were Karen's closest allies, neighbors who had lounged in my pool weeks before, sipping her wine and laughing at her whispered jabs under questioning. It didn't take long for the story to unravel. Karen had convinced them to teach me a lesson, feeding them her paranoia, promising them protection if they were caught. But protection was the one thing she could no longer offer. By dawn, the news had spread. The HOA board released a statement condemning the attack, publicly disavowing Karen and her circle. Neighbors who once tolerated her out of fear now recoiled, unwilling to risk guilt by association. Her name, once spoken with deference or hesitation, became a punchline, a warning, a cautionary tale of hubris gone too far. The police visited her home the next morning. Though she hadn't physically trespassed, her orchestration of the attack placed her in direct violation of the restraining order. She was let out in handcuffs, her defiance finally met with the cold reality of legal consequence. Cameras, this time news cameras, not mine, captured her stumbling into the back of the patrol car, her expression stripped of the smug superiority she had worn like armor for so long. For the first time, the neighborhood truly exhaled. In the days that followed, the board voted to strip Karen of her membership entirely, banning her from attending meetings or influencing policy in any capacity. Her fines remained unpaid, her home stood unkempt, and rumors swirled that she was considering selling. Whether she stayed or left, one fact was certain: her reign of control had ended. I sat by the pool one evening, the water calm and reflective under the soft glow of the lights. For months it had been a battleground, a symbol of conflict and intrusion. Now it was mine again, quiet, private, undisturbed. The surface rippled gently in the breeze, no longer fractured by unwelcome splashes or the echoes of laughter that didn't belong. Karen had tried to claim my pool, then my reputation, then my safety. In the end, she lost everything. The price of her obsession had been steep, but not for me. For once, the cost had landed squarely where it belonged, on Karen and the friends who followed her into ruin. And as I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the filter steady and reassuring, I realized that peace wasn't something handed down by an HOA board or enforced by neighbors' approval. Peace was claimed, defended, and once secured, savored. The pool shimmered under the night sky, untouched and wholly mine. At last, the war was over.